All I ever wanted when I started this channel was to come here every new and full moon and talk with you all about electional opportunities for talismans that were coming up, how you can use them, and encourage you on ways to get started if it was something that you were interested in pursuing. But apparently, that is just too much to ask sometimes. And fate has conspired against me to where that's just not something that's going to be able to happen. While reviewing the elections for the Scorpio new moon, I kind of again ran into that same issue where I was experiencing a lot of problems making elections work. This time it was almost solely due to the problem of Jupiter retrograde interfering, whether because the moon would always apply to Jupiter retrograde when I could get her in a fun mansion, or Jupiter would rule the ascendant, or just there was always something where Jupiter would be in the wrong place in the wrong time. And so instead of coming up with like a different subject to talk about, what I thought would be fun would be to sort of deep dive into one specific election that is coming up that will work out. And that is the Mars Cazimi that's happening on November 17th or 18th, depending on where you are in the world. So I wanted to talk about this election, talk about Mars Cazimi and sort of like the effects of like the purpose of Cazimi in a talismanic operation, and kind of how maybe we should think about moving forward with this if it's something that you're interested in exploring. So what is a Cazimi? So this is something that we talked about a little bit in the previous video where I decreed with the full force and authority of my station as owner of this channel and servant of many cats who had better not be scratching on my couch right now, that chariot and that concept was trash, and we should not count on it to save us. So that was more specifically within the context of like combustion, but Cazimi is another really important point within like the combustion synodic cycle between a planet and the sun. The Cazimi represents the planet's sort of death and rebirth moment. Most of the time, whenever we discuss a planet's synodic cycle, we are kind of interpreting it through the metaphor of a human life cycle. And this is also true with Cazimi, and it feels like a very significant or important role. The idea behind Cazimi is that the planet unites with the sun. And so we see kind of interpretations of this as being like a planet in the heart of the sun, or we'll sometimes see the metaphor within the tradition as Cazimi is like sitting on the lap of the king while he's in his throne. So you're kind of like sharing a seat with the king, and he's like, hey, what do you want for Christmas? Because apparently now he's Santa Claus in my mind. But if we're kind of peeling back this layer, what I would recommend thinking of Cazimi moment as is sort of like reunification with the divine after death. So this goes a little bit into like kind of like religious iconography. So feel free to not really use it if like the kind of religious spin on it isn't really your thing. But a lot of religions have this idea that after death, the soul reunites with the divine before going wherever it's supposed to go, being reincarnated, or just sort of like whatever that religion's idea of whatever happens to the soul after death occurs. There's the separation from the body, the reunification with the divine, and then the going back out to whatever. And so that's what the Cazimi is. It's this reunification with the divine for the planet. The planet reunites with the sun. It is cleansed by the sun. It leaves behind all of its past experiences, and it comes out ready. It comes out separated from the sun, ready to be announced back into the world and start a cycle anew, having left behind a lot of the stuff that it had accumulated in the previous cycle. So we see a lot of kind of metaphors of like purity, purification, cleansing. This is all very Cazimi related. So that's what a Cazimi is. It's when a planet comes like to the same degree and minute as the sun. That's like the Cazimi moment. But we have, in the tradition, sort of like varying levels of what counts as Cazimi. So one of the most generous is a 1-degree orb between the sun and the planet, and that counts as Cazimi. That's sort of like an older Hellenistic version of it. A slightly less generous is the planet and the sun are in the same degree, and that's different than being 1 degree apart. So the same degree is like they're both at 15 degrees of Scorpio in some odd minutes, but being 1 degree apart would allow for the sun to be at 15 degrees and 15 minutes of Scorpio, and some other planet to be in 14 degrees and 57 minutes of Scorpio. So that's a 1 degree orb versus within the same degree where they would both need to be at 15 degrees Scorpio. And then the much more kind of specific is 17 minutes. 17 minutes, 16 minutes of the sun. So I get confused sometimes. And this is one that I personally follow because it reflects a sort of astronomical reality, which is that the disk of the sun when viewed in the sky is 32 minutes wide. It takes up 32 minutes of space, so a little bit over half a degree. And then if you divide 32 by 2, you get 16 minutes going into the sun, and then 16 minutes on kind of like the other side of the sun leaving. And so that's what I like to use. It's very specific, it's very precise, and it matches with an astronomical reality where it's like, oh, the sun and the planet are like actually taking up kind of the same space in the sky right now. And I find that that's very meaningful to me, but it might not be for everybody, and that's fine. Oh. Here's Cinnamon. He's the little couch scratcher usually, and he's going to try to avoid the camera because he knows that he should be ashamed of what he's done. So I like the 16-minute version. Use whatever works for you, I guess, but I really recommend 16 minutes. It's very precise. So that's kind of the purpose of Cazimi. That's what it does in the cycle and kind of how you measure it. Oh, hi, Cinnamon. He's going to sit in my lap. Yes. If you sit in my lap, everybody's going to want to see you and not me. He does not care about that at all. He's going to play with my microphone cord now. So from here, we're basically operating under the premise that a Cazimi can be made into a talisman, that a Cazimi is an appropriate time to make a talisman. And in the past, I've been very skeptical of Cazimi talismans, just because I feel like a lot of people talk about them as if they're just like regular old, run-of-the-mill, all-American, girl next door. That's kind of weird, that's kind of creepy now to think about it, kind of talismans, that there's no difference between a planet being Cazimi and just like a general planetary talisman. And I don't think that's a very good way to think about it. I think anytime we have a planet in a specific condition, that condition is going to come through in the talisman, especially if we make it the focus of the talisman. So I don't think Mars Cazimi talismans or any planetary Cazimi talisman can just be like a fancy stand-in for like a Mars planetary talisman, like Mars in Scorpio, versus like Mars Cazimi. Like those are very different. We have to incorporate some sort of Cazimi theme to make it a Mars Cazimi talisman, because that's what it's going to do. Like it's going to be this thing. And so that's why in the past I've been very skeptical about Cazimi talismans, and also because I go back and forth about whether or not you need general election considerations when making Cazimi talismans, or if the moment of Cazimi itself is the same, like is enough. I tend to be now a little bit more on the side that like the moment of the Cazimi itself is enough, if you're going to come at it through like a Cazimi lens or intention. And so I think maybe I just end up like kind of, I don't know, conflating the issues to some extent, to where I don't think that if you're just going to be like, Mars is Cazimi, I better make myself a Mars planetary talisman while Mars is just Cazimi. Who cares if it's conjoined the ascendant or in a sign that it likes, or if the moon's applying to it, or just kind of like normal things that we would consider, because it's Mars Cazimi and it'll be a Mars talisman. And I'm just not sure. I just don't, that math don't add up to me. But this upcoming Mars Cazimi is very unique in that it sort of mixes in a lot of these different themes that we would look to. It happens in Scorpio, Mars' sign of domicile. You can get the moon to apply to it, and it could even be Mars's day or hour. It can even be Mars's hour in some instances, depending on where it is. But even just having like the moon connection and Mars being in its own sign of Scorpio, I think is really heightens it up for talismanic opportunities. So we're going to take a minute and explore the Mars Cazimi election from our kind of different vantage points from North America, Western Europe, North Africa, and Australia, just to kind of show like what the elections look like, how to make the most of them, I guess, like, and kind of the timing you would want to look for. But we're going to go ahead and dive into these elections for the Mars Cazimi. The first one is going to be for North America, and it's going to take place on November 17th at around 12:02 p.m. And I think this might be the better one because it gets the most pieces together. So what we're looking at here is we've got the Mars Sun Cazimi happening here. The Cazimi's not perfected yet, but we are within that 16-minute orb of the Sun and Mars, which is great. At the same time, we can have the moon apply to that Cazimi, which is super awesome. And it can even be Mars's hour at this time. I know that you can't see it. You can't see the hour listed, but it is Mars's hour right now. And that's really cool as well. It's also like right on the midheaven. There's a lot of like really fun connections in this election for the Cazimi that are super hard to come by with Cazimis. We'll have Saturn as the ruler of the first house. Saturn's in Pisces in the first house, and that's fine. Saturn's not afflicted by anything.
Saturn's not retrograde, so normally what we would consider for this. So all in all, that can work out. Alternatively, you could do a time of like 7:02 in the morning to get the Mars Sun Cazimi on the ascendant. We are still within our 16-minute orb here, and now the moon is just kind of slightly further out from that sextile, but she is still applying that sextile. And this is another option you can use. The ruler of the first house is now this Mars. We lose the Mars hour; it's now Venus's day and hour. But I mean, other than that, this is a really strong contender too. So North America has kind of like two really good options if they wanted, either Mars, the Mars Cazimi on the ascendant, or the Mars Cazimi on the midheaven. If you really wanted to, you could wait until the Mars Cazimi like perfected exactly, which happens closer to midnight, I think. Let me double check that. Yeah, it's it's just a few minutes after midnight. This is like 12:02 a.m. You don't quite have a lot of like the electional connections that we would normally look for a talisman making. And if you wanted to do this, I would recommend making the talisman during the time and then ritualizing it as part of like the Kazimi perfection later on, if you wanted to, because we no longer have the moon application. The ruler of the first house is Mars. We've got kind of like an unaffiliated Saturn here opposite the ascendant, which isn't super great. So we lose a lot of the electional fun stuff that we would normally want to hang on to. But that moment of the Cazimi perfecting is obviously very important because it's the Cazimi itself. So the Western Europe and Northern African version is going to end up looking very similar to the North American version. It's also going to be on November 17th at 12:02 a.m. And here we're going to have, again, like the Mars Sun Cazimi happening very close to the midheaven degree, where we are within that 16-minute orb that we watch out for. The moon is still applying to the sextile of the Cazimi, which is great. We're kind of further out than we were with the North American version. And we're going to have Capricorn, probably mid-Capricorn rising, depending on exactly where you are, instead of the Aquarius rising. And that's still going to be that Saturn as the ruler of the first house in Pisces, which is totally fine. And that's going to be kind of that option. As a potential alternative to maybe consider, Western Europe and Northern Africa has a really interesting situation where on November 18th at 8:09 a.m., so like the next day, the Mars Cazimi has just happened. The Mars and the Sun are 1 minute apart. Like the Cazimi has literally just happened, where the Sun is now separating by 1 minute, and you can get that on the ascendant, which I think is really neat. The part that I don't like about this is that we lose the moon's aspect. So the moon has just separated the sextile from this, and now she's applying this square to the retrograde Jupiter. And like if Jupiter wasn't retrograde, I might be like, you know what, do it. But with Jupiter being retrograde, I would not really recommend it, and that's kind of unfortunate because having this super close to the ascendant is really kind of cool. And then finally for Australia, on November 18th at 5:03 a.m., they can have kind of that situation with the Mars Cazimi on the ascendant, here separated by, what is this, 8 minutes? The moon still applies to it, which is really great. And this can be a good, this can be it, you know what I mean? Like we don't have Saturn's, right now it's Saturn day, Saturn's hour in this one, so we don't quite have the hour that we need. But we can get it if we wait until, what is it, about 8:25. So if we move forward in time to about 8:25, we can have the Sun Mars Cazimi now like 5 minutes apart, so a little bit closer. In the 11th house, which, you know, isn't as angular as we would normally like, so that's sort of what you're trading out. But now in Mars's hour, and you would still have the moon applying that sextile to it very closely, which I think is fun. So I think either of these could work. You end up kind of trading out the angularity for the hour, and I think that's kind of a personal choice, depending on which one you want to do best. I don't hate Venus being super angular in this chart because Venus is doing well in Libra. But I mean, you know, it's also not a Venus event, you know what I mean? So that might not be such a great option. But it's not necessarily spoiling the situation. So it mostly comes down to, do you want the hour? Do you want to maintain the hour? In which case, do the 8:25-ish time. But if you just want like the angularity and the moon applying to it, then do the 5:03 time.
Well, all right. Well, now that you guys have your alarm set, like, what can you actually do with the Mars Cazimi talisman? You know, I went on this kind of like tirade before about how I don't think that Cazimi talismans can just be like your general stand-in planetary talismans. I don't think they can work that way. So, what would be the point of a Cazimi talisman? And this is also something I've gone back and forth a bit on. Because I think it can be very hard to like distinguish these things or like philosophize about what they should and ought to be. And how they might operate slightly differently. But I think the big thing is that there is gonna have to be some form of like cleansing or purification involved in these talismans. That's gonna have to be their goal to some extent. So I often recommend Kazimis be ritualized rather than talismanified. We're gonna go with it. Partly because it's very rare for us to have kind of like the electional lineup, like configurations to necessitate or like to make a talisman worth executing. But Kazimis themselves are really important points in a planet cycle, so I think that they're interesting enough to fall back on. I usually recommend them to people who are considering starting a planetary remediation practice as a good starting point, since the Cazimi itself is about a planet kind of like leaving behind one cycle and starting a new cycle, leaving behind like old experiences and things like that. It makes a really good point to start over and be like, okay, Mars, we've had a really difficult relationship moving forward. Like, we've had a really difficult relationship in the past, but what if we just kind of like started over on a clean slate and moved forward together with like a new sense of mutual understanding and trust? That I think makes a whole lot of sense with the Cazimi, because a blank slate is what the Cazimi is doing. Like that's the whole point of the Cazimi, is to start over with the planet. So I usually recommend to people who are thinking about starting a planetary mediation process, but also for people who have had a difficult experience with that planet, like with something from that planet's domain. So Venus Cazimis I recommend a lot to people who are coming out of really difficult long-term relationships, to kind of help them leave behind those negative experiences from that past relationship, to kind of like keep that relationship baggage from moving into their next relationship, to keep them from sort of like repeating those same issues or having, you know, the problems from their previous relationship influence their next relationship, because they probably don't need that. For a lot of the planetary Cazimi talismans, I think you can follow kind of like a general theme of purifying the negative into something more positive, like burning away the bad to make way for the good, or to start over. One thing that I think could be very helpful, particularly with Mars, like with this Mars Cazimi coming up, would be ways to kind of transmute anger into something more positive. So as much as we talk about malefic planets as being difficult to work with, obviously that is true, but they do have redeeming qualities that are worth experiencing, that have value in everyday life and can be, you know, good and purposeful to accomplish, you know, good things. So for Mars, we talk a lot about its ability to like make anger, make war, make hatred, make us violent, make us aggressive. And all that is very true with Mars. But what if we could instead work with Mars in such a way to make a talisman that takes those negative aspects of Mars and turns it into something else? So something that can like take that anger and rage that Mars is known for and turning it into like valor and courage, or kind of taking the aggressiveness that Mars is known for and turning it into like assertiveness and self-expression, and things like that. Just like anything that can take those more negative aspects of Mars and turn them into something more positive, make them like kind of like transmute them into something that's more worth having, rather than constantly like running from Mars or disliking Mars or being skeptical towards Mars. And just kind of like trying to block out those more positive aspects, because it's true that like the malefic planets particularly are especially gifted in causing chaos in our lives and injecting things that we generally see as like societally inappropriate or like harmful to us as individuals. But there are forms of those planets, and all planets, that can be, you know, focused into something more positive and make changes. And so that's what I would recommend more Cazimi talismans used for. Kind of like transmuting those negative experiences into more positive experiences, making it as a first step. I would even probably recommend that. Yeah, making like a Mars Cazimi talisman as a first step towards Mars remediation could be a really good step to go. because normally I don't recommend making talismans for planets that you struggle with until you do a certain amount of remediation. But with the Cazimi, I think that could be a really good like combination of things to do. And then kind of finally, like what materials would you make this talisman out of? What would be the like what would be its physical substance? And for this, I think you could pretty much use whatever you would normally use for talisman making. But one thing that I would really recommend incorporating, especially in a Mars talisman, is steel. So typically, iron is the metal that's associated with Mars, but steel is just iron that's gone, through another kind of fired process with carbon to come out stronger and better than the iron was. And I think that is like such a chef's kiss. Metaphor or symbol for the Mars Cazimi that it would be really silly not to take advantage of it. So however you want to include steel in your talismanic process will be fine, like whether like actually make the talisman out of steel or just kind of like include some steel in it or something like that. Absolutely do that. I think that's a really great way to do it. And then yeah, just kind of go about it as you normally would a Mars planetary talisman. But I really think the steel process, like the steel material is such a great thing to use that it would be a shame to miss it. So I think steel is just really good. But all right, thank you everybody so much for being here and listening to me talk about Cazimi and Mars. And I hope that if you're thinking about moving forward with making this Mars Cazimi talisman, or thinking about ritualizing it in some form, maybe you don't want to make a talisman or you don't quite like how the configuration lines up for you are, that's totally fine. I would love to hear about ways that you have used malefic planets more positively, whether that's through like talismans or just kind of being aware of how these planets affect you and making conscious efforts not to be affected that way or not to come across that way or express yourself that way. I'd love to hear those stories. But all right, everybody take care, and I will see you next time on the Gemini full moon, where hopefully I will have like some elections to share. We'll find out though.